It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. Welcome to my listeners here on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio. And remember, you can download the iHeartRadio app and listen to the show wherever you are, whenever you like. You can listen to prior podcasts of the show. You can check out some of my bi-weekly columns on Penn Live or the American Thinker or Western Journal, or check out some great merchandise. So all can be found on the markscaringishow.com website. And don't forget to subscribe to our show on YouTube, and you can send me a tweet on Twitter, and we'll try to read your tweet on the air. And you can tune in to one of the various Facebook Live programs that we have running currently so that you can see us here in the studio and comment live via Facebook. Well, welcome again to the show. And Democrats and the media, they finally had their day in court, so to speak. Earlier this week, the entire country watched as former special counsel Bob Mueller took his seat before the House Judiciary and then the House Intelligence Committees, and finally testified before Congress. And it turned out to be probably one of the most embarrassing days in the career of Bob Mueller, and really it put the last and hopefully the final egg on the face of Bob Mueller, the Democrats, and the entire mainstream media. Mueller's performance ranks up there with that of Christine Blasey Ford as probably the worst appearance before Congress, and that's saying something since Christine Blasey Ford is the slightly addled former hippie surfer girl from California who completely trumped up and fabricated charges against Brett Kavanaugh, the Trump administration's nominee for Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Her testimony fell apart. Her credibility was destroyed, and she went down as one of the worst witnesses in congressional hearing testimony history, probably until Bob Mueller. And Mueller, his performance was widely panned by even the mainstream media, which is remarkable. But to make matters worse, Bob Mueller is the former director of the FBI, a man who has testified before Congress many, many, many times over the course of his long career. He was the former top cop in America. He presided over a 2-year-long, $30 million special investigation of the President of the United States and his campaign colleagues. And that investigation that Mueller purportedly presided over included 40 FBI agents, 19 lawyers, prosecutors, intelligence analysts, forensic accountants. They used and served 2,800 subpoenas, executed 500 search warrants, 230 orders for communications records, 5 pen registers, that's wiretaps. And that was all of which resulted in a big nothing. And Bob Mueller was the man in charge of this entire investigation, this entire operation. And when he took to the witness stand before the eyes of the country, it became very evident that this man is nearly completely out of touch. He was completely out to lunch during his testimony, and that reveals he probably was out to lunch during the 2 years, a year and a half or 2 years long, that he presided over this investigation. Their wags in the media have reported that, boy, the one thing they've learned about the Mueller testimony is that he didn't read his own report. He obviously didn't write his own report, and it was just about the president referred to it as a disgrace the Mueller testimony before Congress. And this man, Bob Mueller, is the man we saw every Saturday night on Saturday Night Live, who was going to be somehow the savior of the Democratic Party. The man who knew all, heard all, and was slowly and methodically putting together an airtight case against the president to take down an incumbent president of the United States. This was Bob Mueller, as depicted to us by our friends in the liberal media, by our friends in Hollywood, in the power centers across the country. This was the man who was fierce and sharp as a wit, and who was a prosecutor who was following the evidence wherever it led. He had Trump in his vice grips, and he was slowly closing them, and he would bring down this presidency. Boy, was that a bunch of hogwash. Even the mainstream media, or at least, some of those who have some semblance of non-bias, or at least the ability every once in a while to characterize or analyze a situation in the political sphere in a somewhat non-prejudiced, non-biased way. Even they said Mueller's testimony was terrible. Fox News, Chris Wallace said the Mueller hearing has been a disaster for Democrats. It's been a disaster for the reputation of Robert Mueller. That's from Chris Wallace, who can be very tough on Republicans, very tough on Donald Trump. NBC, its left-wing commentator and the host of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, who's an extreme left-wing liberal Democrat, who NBC, of course, puts out there to the public as an impartial, non-biased journalist. That's, of course, a fraud. But even Chuck Todd, who has called the president racist and misogynist and horrible names, even Chuck Todd said the Mueller hearing was an optics disaster. It didn't advance the cause for the Trump impeachment. And what about left-wing MSNBC? They have Jeremy Bash over there, and Jeremy Bash said Mueller sucked the life out of the Mueller report. He was boring, evasive. He seemed lost at times. ABC News, their senior national political correspondent, Terry Moran, he said impeachment's over, noting that Democrats needed more fuel for any kind of impeachment effort. And I think across the board, any reasonable, objective observer of Mueller's performance before Congress must conclude that this man was completely out of his depth, and obviously was not in control and not at least adequately supervising the investigators and prosecutors who he hired to conduct this investigation. Often through these hearings, Bob Mueller had to be informed by congressional Republicans who were cross-examining him what was in his own report. It was embarrassing. The man was stuttering. He was forgetful. He was timid. He was meek. He was very mild. The man, there's really no there in Bob Mueller, who was sold to us as the man who was going to take down the president and the man who would be the savior of the country and all of that. Turned out not to be the case. We'll talk more about Bob Mueller's disastrous testimony before the United States Congress when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. We're talking today about the appearance of special counsel, I guess it's now former special counsel, Bob Mueller, before two congressional hearings testifying in support of his 400-page report that he wrote that presented the evidentiary findings and the conclusions of Bob Mueller from his 2-year-long investigation into the allegations that the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. Now, those of you who are weekly listeners of the Mark Scaringi Show or read any of my columns in the various news publications where they appear, they know that we've been talking about how this whole investigation is fake and a fraud from the beginning. We've analyzed it from a legal standpoint multiple times and exposed the failures and the fraud of this investigation from the very beginning. And I've taken some heat politically as a result of that. We had some an individual, that antitrust lawyer, I forget his name. He's lives somewhere around here in the greater Harrisburg area, writing a column in Penn Live, the Patriot News, condemning my earlier column that pointed out that Bob Mueller's investigation was doing harm to America. Mueller's investigation continues despite the harm it's doing to America's reputation, is the title of a column I wrote back in December of 2017. And as I say, I took some flack for that. Some individuals were alleging that my columns and my analysis of Bob Mueller's fake investigation was doing harm to America's reputation for fairness and justice. And I think by all unbiased, impartial observers, apparently I was right and my skeptics were wrong. And I'm just going to read a brief excerpt from that particular column, and then I want to open up the phone banks and take some calls and hear from our listeners what they think about Bob Mueller's testimony before Congress. But back in 2017, I wrote, "As Special Counsel Bob Mueller's investigation grinds on, it's obvious the real collusions occurred among the Clinton campaign, the Obama administration, the so-called deep state, and the media, first to defeat the campaign and then candidate Donald J. Trump, and now overturn the 2016 presidential election. In recent weeks, we've learned of the deep partisanship, inherent conflicts of interest, and avowed never-Trumpism of many of Mueller's team. The media, however, have decided to cover a different story, one they've spun out of whole cloth, to distract from the real news about Bob Mueller and how he has stacked the deck against Trump. The media have released a school of red herrings, spreading a fishy tale about the president and how the president's on the verge of firing Mueller. Remember all of that? All of those news stories we heard about how Trump was on the verge of firing Mueller. He was going to fire him. The media then condemned the president for something he hasn't done. He never fired Bob Mueller. Yet there's nothing fair about a virulently partisan team of investigators and prosecutors seeking to destroy the presidency of their political opponent based upon trumped-up charges paid for by the politician they wanted to win, a.k.a. Hillary Clinton. And these former prosecutors are mistaken if they think Mueller is burnishing America's reputation for justice and fairness by prosecuting individuals for dubious crimes, such as making false but immaterial statements about non-criminal conduct, or for offenses that have nothing to do with alleged Trump-Russian election interference, which is the actual purpose of the investigation. Now, those are just a few of the words I wrote over a year and a half ago about how Bob Mueller was harming the reputation of the United States of America for fairness and justice. And if you watch Bob Mueller's performance before the United States Congress just a few days ago, I think he proved my point many times over. Not just in stacking the deck with partisan Democrats intent upon destroying their political enemy, President Trump, not just in Mueller's his hands-off approach to the supervision of his partisan investigators and prosecutors that was so hands-off, one wonders if he ever had a hand on. Or if not a hand, at least a finger. Did Bob Mueller even have a finger on the investigation that he was allegedly in charge of, or actually was legally in charge of? You know, not just in the fact that he conducted a nearly 2-year-long investigation of the president and his colleagues into a non-crime based upon fake evidence provided to him by the president's political opponents, who were the ones in cooperation with some Russians spreading disinformation about Donald Trump. But probably the worst of all of this is Mueller's decision in Volume 2 of his report to announce that he could not exonerate the president and could not conclusively determine that the president did not commit the crime of obstruction of justice. And we'll talk more about that particular flaw, that fundamental flaw that's a disaster for Bob Mueller's report, in particular Volume 2. We'll talk more about that when we discuss some of the Republican congressman's cross-examination of Bob Mueller that was just brutal. And one may feel sorry for Mueller as he was just eviscerated left and right when he took the stand, when he testified. But I don't feel sorry for the man. Look, for 2 years, while he's in charge of this investigation, the American people believe, or they're told to believe, that Donald Trump has committed multiple crimes, including collusion and obstruction of justice, and he will be either prosecuted, removed from office, and in the least, impeached. And I'll refer you to the column I wrote in April of 2019 that appeared in American Thinker, and you can check it out on the Mark Scaringi Show website. And here's what I said. Special Counsel Bob Mueller claims correctly that a traditional prosecution or declination decision, the decision to decline to prosecute, is a binary choice, to prosecute or not to prosecute. And Mueller was able to make a decision regarding collusion, so why couldn't he make one regarding obstruction? He claims he couldn't because the Office of Legal Counsel had previously opined that a sitting president cannot be indicted. He also claims that it would be unfair to accuse the president of committing a crime without indicting him and thus denying him the right to defend himself in court to clear his name. Do any of you out there think that Bob Mueller spared Trump's name, that Bob Mueller took action to protect the reputation of Donald Trump? I don't think so. Read Volume 2. Read the statement that Bob Mueller gave at the press conference that he decided to have for himself. So why did Bob Mueller spend millions of taxpayer dollars investigating the president for obstruction of justice when Bob Mueller himself said he wouldn't indict him for it anyway? Mueller claims that he was creating and preserving a record for the future. Well, perhaps when Trump is no longer president and thus can be indicted. But Mueller also wrote that he was concerned that indicting Trump would preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct. Well, what does Mueller mean by preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct? You have to read one of the footnotes. You have to read the footnote to that statement in his report. He meant impeachment. So Bob Mueller didn't charge obstruction because he didn't want to preempt the Democrats' impeachment plans. Is that being fair to the man you're investigating and you couldn't find enough evidence to charge him with obstruction of justice? So you're going to protect his presumption of innocence and his right to his reputation by creating a roadmap for Democrats to impeach him for what? Obstruction of justice, the offense you declined to charge him with. That's not fair. And that's yet another example of the harm that Bob Mueller has done to the American system of justice. Instead of performing his duty as a prosecutor, Mueller was busy creating a roadmap to impeachment. He made a political decision, not a legal one. How many of you want our prosecutors, who are paid for by you and me, the taxpayers, how many of you want our prosecutors to be making political decisions instead of decisions based upon the law, the facts, and the evidence before them? Bob Mueller was appointed to investigate any coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. He was authorized to interfere in the presidential election. He was authorized to prosecute any federal crimes arising from his investigation. He admitted there was no evidence of collusion, conspiracy, or even the made-up crime called coordination. Yet on corruption, instead of reaching the obvious conclusion, he deferred to Congress. But Mueller is a prosecutor. He's not a member of Congress. His job is to enforce the criminal code, not to facilitate impeachment. Where Mueller played the politician, Attorney General Bill Barr came in and played the prosecutor. Remember, when Barr saved the day, he determined the evidence provided by Mueller was insufficient to establish an obstruction of justice charge. That's what a prosecutor is supposed to do. In reaching that decision, Barr based his conclusion on the evidence, which is what prosecutors, again, are supposed to do. Barr even examined the evidence using Mueller's unconventional legal theory and I wrote a column about that a person can be charged with obstruction for carrying out his lawful duties, and Barr still found no obstruction. Mueller, on the other hand, laid out the, quote, factual issues, end quote, that he believes could support an obstruction charge. And here they are. Public attacks on the investigation. Non-public efforts to control it. That's interesting. Non-public efforts to control it. And efforts in both public and private to encourage witnesses not to cooperate with the investigation. And you can check out my column where I go through each allegation, each of these three allegations that Bob Mueller made in volume 2 of his report on the obstruction. And I show how there's nothing to substantiate the allegations that Bob Mueller made. You know, in the end, Special Counsel Bob Mueller has done significant damage to the Trump presidency. Day in and day out, we all heard how our president had committed crimes and how the president should be impeached for the commission of these heinous crimes, none of which was true. And Bob Mueller did this damage to the American system of justice, to the American people, because he refused to do what he was appointed to do. And he's fueled the fires for impeachment, at least until he testified a few days ago. And I think all those fires have gone out. And as I argued back then, we're going to spend the next year and a half with the Democrats beating the drums of impeachment, even though the special counsel exonerated the president of committing the crime for which the special counsel was appointed. And the attorney general cleared the president of obstruction of justice. And Mueller reports that Trump complained the appointment of the special counsel will end his presidency. Well, let's hope the American people see this for what it is. It was a political prosecution, not a legal one. And I think Bob Mueller's his personal appearance and his testimony before Congress just a few days ago sealed that deal. And I think now the American people know exactly what this was. Democrats are still braying for impeachment, but it's not coming. Not after Bob Mueller's presentation of a few days ago. More on this when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking about Special Counsel Bob Mueller, his appearance before the United States Congress, testified before 2 congressional committees just a few days ago, and his performance has been widely panned, even by members of the mainstream media, as a total disaster for his reputation, a disaster for Democrats, and a disaster for their impeachment plans. And as I said earlier, I know many of you feel sorry for Bob Mueller today, or you may. You watched his pathetic appearance before Congress. You watched him stumble and mumble and forget. You watched as this 70-plus-year-old man who was eviscerated by congressional Republicans under cross-examination. How about Representative Jim Jordan's cross-examination of Mueller? That was brutal. And as Jordan is asking very direct and precise questions, Mueller's shuffling through his pages, trying to find the pages in his report that Jordan is questioning him about. Remember, Mueller didn't write the report. It appears Mueller was barely involved in this investigation that he was supposed to be in charge of. And there's Jim Jordan hammering him about how Mueller's own report reveals that the FBI's own informant, Joseph Misfud, lied to the FBI, lied to Mueller's FBI agents 3 times during the investigation, and yet Mueller didn't charge Misfud with lying to the FBI or obstruction of justice. Yet Mueller charged multiple Trump associates with lying to the FBI about matters that had nothing to do with the non-existent collusion. And yet, what was Mueller's response to Jordan exposing the hypocrisy of Bob Mueller not charging his own informant, Joseph Misfud? Mueller's response, I cannot get into internal deliberations with regard to who or would not be charged. What? Bob Mueller spent hundreds of pages of his report explaining and deliberating over the charge he ultimately decided he would not bring against Trump, and that's the obstruction of justice charge. So Bob Mueller had no problem explaining his deliberations reasons why he chose not to charge Donald Trump for obstruction of justice. Yet Bob Mueller can't answer a simple question from a congressman. Why didn't you charge Joseph Misfud for lying to the FBI when you, in your own report, explain that Misfud lied to you 3 times? Bob Mueller can't get into that. Mueller didn't know that his own report explained that it was Joseph Misfud, the FBI's own source. He's the man who told George Papadopoulos that the Russians had dirt on Clinton. Papadopoulos then tells a former diplomat, the Australian diplomat we've all heard about, with whom he was having drinks at a London bar. Papadopoulos tells the diplomat that very same gossip that he heard from Misfud. And what does the foreign diplomat do? He then contacts the FBI, and he says something to the effect of, hey, I was in a bar in London, and I was talking to some guy claiming to be associated with the Trump campaign, and he says what? Well, he says the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton. That's it. Well, did he say that the Trump campaign is colluding with the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 presidential election? No. Did he say that the Trump campaign is colluding with the Russians to steal incriminating information about Hillary Clinton? No. Well, what did he say again? Well, we were in a bar in London. It was noisy. We were having several drinks. And George Papadopoulos, who claims he's with the Trump campaign, he said he heard from someone else that the Russians, and which Russians? I mean, I don't know. There are a lot of Russians, 100, 200 million of them. Some Russians, they've got some dirt on Hillary Clinton. That's it. The FBI takes that gossip, double hearsay, if you will, and launches a counterintelligence investigation against then-candidate Donald J. Trump and his campaign, gets a FISA warrant based upon this bar talk, and surveils Carter Page, wiretaps Carter Page, eavesdrops on Carter Page's telecommunications to try to build a case. And by the way, where is Carter Page? Shouldn't he be the star witness in Mueller's prosecution against the Trump campaign for collusion? Oh, that's right. There was no collusion. Mueller says insufficient evidence for collusion. How about no evidence for collusion? This is it. I mean, this is the evidence, the alleged evidence that was used to launch this investigation. When Jim Jordan, a Republican congressman, during cross-examination of Bob Mueller at the congressional hearing, when he asked Mueller, well, who told Papadopoulos that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton? Mueller lied in response. Mueller said, I can't get into the evidentiary findings. Mueller then slurred his speech, as he did repeatedly through the hearing, so it's hard. It was at times hard to understand what Mueller actually said. It's like listening to Joe Biden give a speech. He slurs his words so much, and then he clips his sentences short, where you don't know what the heck the man is actually saying. So Mueller said, well, I can't get into the evidentiary, I think he said findings. But then Mueller slurred, and then he seemed to say filings. And I'm not sure whether Mueller is referring to maybe I don't know what he's talking about, dental filings. Maybe he had some dental work which caused him to slur his speech. But in any event, Mueller couldn't get into the evidentiary findings to answer Jim Jordan's question. But in any event, let's say Mueller meant evidentiary findings and not filings. But why? Why can't Bob Mueller get into the evidentiary findings? His whole report is a report of the evidentiary findings of his investigation. So Mueller is obviously making a false statement to Congressman Jim Jordan during this hearing. He could absolutely get into the evidentiary findings. He did for 400 pages in his report. And the real kicker is, after Mueller says, well, he cannot say who told Papadopoulos that the Russians had dirt on Hillary, Jordan said, oh, what did Jordan say? Well, Mr. Mueller, you already told us in your report who told Papadopoulos. And it's on page 192. Oh, my goodness. Mueller is just caught in lying to Congress during his hearing. And watch the video of this. Mueller is meekly, meekly looks at his report, and he pulls his report to him like it's some sort of crutch, as if he's looking as if he's looking for page 192. But Jim Jordan, the gentleman that he is, jumps in and says, "I'll tell you the answer because it's right on your own report, page 192. In your report, you say it was Joseph Misfud who told the FBI about what Papadopoulos said to the Australian diplomat." And then Bob Mueller rolls his eyes. It's a made-for-TV moment. So just Google that one. Google the cross-examination of Jim Jordan's cross-examination of Bob Mueller. And Mueller just realized he was caught in the lie. So the entire investigation of the Trump campaign is based upon, or the origins of it, is based upon Joseph Misfud, who was an FBI informant, telling George Papadopoulos, a very loosely aligned member of the Trump campaign, that Russians have information on Hillary Clinton. And that same Joseph Misfud, according to the special counsel's own report, lied to the FBI investigators just 3 times. Well, just 3 lies. But the fourth statement that he told us, we're going to use that one and we're going to launch an investigation. That's it. I mean, the rest of the cross-examination by Jim Jordan has Mueller repeatedly stating, I can't get into that, can't get into that, I can't get into that, I can't get into that, including one question by Jim Jordan, well, did you interview Joseph Misfud? Mueller says, I can't get into that. Really? Bob Mueller can't say whether or not he interviewed a witness? That's somehow disclosing some sort of confidential, top secret information. It's disclosing the codes to our nuclear arsenal. If we answer whether or not we interviewed a witness, come on, that's just preposterous. Jim Jordan's cross-examination was outstanding. He eviscerated Bob Mueller. He revealed Bob Mueller to be lying. He revealed Bob Mueller didn't even know what his own report had disclosed. You also had the cross-examination of Matt Gaetz, and that was equally devastating to Bob Mueller. And Matt Gaetz, one of his questions to Bob Mueller, could you state with confidence that the Steele dossier was not part of Russia's disinformation campaign? Mueller said that he could not so state, apparently because he did not examine the Steele dossier. Bob Mueller did not examine the origins of the FBI investigation. The Steele dossier served as the basis of the investigation that he was presiding over because, according to Bob Mueller, well, the Steele dossier, that came to us, that came to the FBI before I took over the investigation. So Mueller said the Steele report is beyond my purview. Wow, remarkable. It's that one statement from Joseph Misfud about what an Australian diplomat heard George Papadopoulos say in a bar in London over drinks, and the Steele dossier. That's it. That's the evidence that for the past 3 years our country has been dragged through this hoax and fraud of an investigation. More about Bob Mueller's testimony before Congress when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking about Bob Mueller, former special counsel, who led the investigation into Donald Trump and the Trump campaign in desperate search, for some evidence of collusion or coordination or conspiracy, whatever you want to call it, between the Trump campaign and the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. He found none. Thus, he concocted this cockamamie idea that it's possible that the president obstructed justice of an investigation into him in which there was no crime. And we're talking about how Bob Mueller was eviscerated on the witness stand when he testified before Congress. He was the last great hope. His testimony, his appearance was the last great hope for the Democratic Party in their effort to impeach the president on something that did not occur and that the president did not do. Hopefully, this is the end of the 3-year-long saga over the Russian hoax. I'm sure it's not, though. Democrats are desperate, and there are, I think, 4 additional Democrats in the last day or two announced their support for impeachment of the president, even though their star witness was absolutely annihilated on the witness stand. And the most brutal cross-examination, and I'll go through one more cross-examination, and then I want to open up the phone lines, and I want you to call in and tell me what you think about Bob Mueller's performance. He was your special counsel. You paid for his salary, his benefits, his $30 million. You paid for his investigators, his analysts, his prosecutors, the forensic accountants he hired. You paid for it all. You, the taxpayers. Call in and tell me, how do you think Bob Mueller performed on the stand? Call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. Were your tax dollars well spent by the Bob Mueller investigation into the president? And I want to talk about one more cross-examination. Representative Stubbe of Florida. Boy, was that a powerful cross-examination. Apparently this Republican congressman represents Sarasota, Florida. So just about half of Pennsylvania now lives in Sarasota, Florida, as they have all retired down to the warmer weather of Florida, although it's pretty darn hot today. It's like a little bit of Sarasota is here in central Pennsylvania. But you should be proud that your congressman down there in western Florida did such an outstanding job just destroying Bob Mueller on the stand of just a few days ago. It was a brutal cross-examination. It exposed Bob Mueller for the fraud that he is. Bob Mueller wrote in his report, "This report does not exonerate the president." This report does not exonerate the president. And Democrats and the media, they have clung to that statement, and they are vesting their entire impeachment effort on those words from Bob Mueller. Now, upon questioning by the Republican congressman, Mueller could not identify the Department of Justice rule that authorizes a prosecutor to determine that a person being investigated is not exonerated. Mueller could not give one example in which the Department of Justice determined that the person being investigated was not exonerated because their innocence was not conclusively determined by the prosecutors and investigators. And when the congressman asked Bob Mueller why he could not point to a Department of Justice rule that authorizes him to make this statement, or why Bob Mueller could not point to one previous case by the Department of Justice in which the investigators and prosecutors announced that they could not exonerate the suspect they were investigating, Bob Mueller's response, "This is a unique situation." And then he slurred off, and I'm not sure what he said after that. Actually, he didn't say anything after that. He said, "This is unique," started to slur, and then the word that got out of his mouth was situation. So Bob Mueller's response is, the reason why, despite the fact the Department of Justice does not authorize him to make this statement, despite the fact he's not aware of any prior Department of Justice case in which the Department of Justice made the statement, despite that, Bob Mueller was able to say in his report that this report does not exonerate the president. Again, his response as to why he made that statement, this is a unique situation. And that's what is so scary about Bob Mueller. A unique situation. This is the worst thing that Bob Mueller said. Mueller meant it was a unique case because he was investigating the president. So Mueller essentially said the president does not get the presumption of innocence that Americans and English men and women have enjoyed for about 1,000 years. The presumption of innocence is one of the bedrock principles of the Anglo-American system of justice. Now, I don't expect people like Representative Ilhan Omar, the former Somali immigrant, to understand the bedrock principles of Anglo-American justice. But I do expect the former FBI director to understand that in America, we the people, we have something called the presumption of innocence. And even if we rise to the highest levels in the political system, despite all of the odds, and we upset every Democrat in America. We upset every member of the media in America. All of the fashionable and the pretty people in Hollywood and in New York, we upset them all. We rise all the way up to the presidency. We still have the presumption of innocence. But Bob Mueller said, well, this is unique. It's a unique case, and that's why I did, and I said, and I went against Department of Justice rules, I went against Department of Justice tradition, and I stated publicly that I cannot exonerate the president. I cannot exonerate him. That is what is so wrong about Bob Mueller, and that's why he has done so much damage to the American system of justice and to America. Prosecutors do not exonerate suspects if they do not find probable cause that the person has committed a crime. They close the investigation and say nothing. They do not make a public announcement and release a 400-page report explaining how and why they did not find a crime. Let's say your name is John Smith, and you live somewhere in the Harrisburg area, and you have a neighbor, and you and your neighbor have been disagreeing and fighting for years and years, and it's gotten so bad that your neighbor hates you. He loathes and despises you, and he will do whatever it takes to destroy you. And let's say you have a good name in the community, you have a good reputation as an upstanding person in the community, you're a civic leader, you're the head of, let's say, the Little League baseball team in your community, and your neighbor hates you, and he wants to take you down. So he calls the local police department, and he says, you know what? I heard at a bar in Susquehanna Township, I heard someone say that John Smith, well, he has a cache of child pornography. This is what your neighbor says to the police department. He heard this in a bar. Well, the chief of police of the police department, who also happens to despise you, decides that he's going to launch an investigation based upon this tip that he gets from your neighbor who hates you. The evidence, well, it's something the neighbor who hates you overheard in a bar while drinking with somebody else, that you, John Smith, you have a cache of child pornography. So the entire wealth and power of the law enforcement administration in your area and your town is brought to bear against you. For 2 or 3 years, there is an investigation. $30 million is spent. You have to hire lawyers after lawyer after lawyer, and lawyers charge legal fees, and we're not against that. That's okay. That's okay. But it's bankrupted you. You have to sell your house, sell your cars to defend yourself. And at the end of the 3 years, the police chief who hates you, he gives a press conference, and he says, you know what? We've conducted a 3-year-long investigation. Here's a 400-page report that details in depth all of the evidentiary findings, the conclusions, our characterizations, our analysis. And at the end of the day, you know, we cannot exonerate John Smith of the crime of felony possession of child pornography. We just can't do it. We cannot exonerate. Well, did you find evidence to charge him with the crime of child pornography, officer? No, we didn't. No. Well, we're not sure. There may be some evidence. It depends upon your interpretation. If you use a real broad interpretation of child pornography, somebody might be able to bring a case against him. But we're not really sure. We don't know. We don't know whether John Smith has child pornography or not. But I'll tell you one thing we're sure of. We can't exonerate him. We can't say he's innocent of possessing. He's not innocent of possessing child pornography. Now, what if you're John Smith? How do you feel? How do you feel? Do you believe that you have received the presumption of innocence? This is what Bob Mueller has brought this country to. And this is what Democrats and their cohorts in the mainstream media have brought this country down to. So we've had a 3-year-long discussion. At the end of the day, the prosecutor, whose job is to decide whether to charge a crime or decline to charge a crime based upon the evidence, this prosecutor says, well, we're not charging him with the crime of child pornography, but we're not going to decline to charge him with the crime of child pornography, and we're not going to say he didn't do it. It's possible that he did. That's what this country has come to because of the maniacal desire by the never-Trumpers and the deep staters and the Democratic Party to destroy this president. And in doing so, they've destroyed the presumption of innocence that all of us have a constitutional right to enjoy. In fact, a right that precedes the Constitution by several hundred years. That's about all the time we have today for the Mark Scarinci Show. I want to thank you for listening. Hi, this is attorney Mark Scarinci. Every Saturday afternoon at 1, thousands of central Pennsylvanians listen to the Mark Scarinci Show on WHP 580. It's a program about state, local, and national politics from the point of view of putting America first. If your business or organization would like to reach my listeners, you can advertise on my show. Promote your business on the only weekend political show in central PA. Call 717-657-7770 and talk with Jason to promote your business on the Mark Scarinci Show.